Artur Beterbiev defends his light heavyweight titles against a very brave, very gutsy Anthony Yarde, stopping him in the 8th round of what was a light heavyweight classic. I'm going to talk about this fight in the sense where I'm just going to give my overall impressions of it, because I'm sure most of you guys have probably seen it. If you haven't, there are copies all over YouTube, so relatively easy to find a copy to watch. So I'm going to give my impressions of it, zoom in on some of the technical aspects, especially where I feel the fight was won and lost, and yeah, go from there and basically just give reflections on this fight, because ultimately it was a very good fight. Although I do see it as not really the hardest fight to read. That being said, for the record, I have watched it twice, and I watched the fight live and watched it second time just before recording this video. And I must say that the second time watching, I do have a bit more of an appreciation for the work that Yarde did early. I think he did start really well, and there were some issues there. It wasn't the perfect start, but for the most part, I feel like Yarde came out, did look a little bit nervous. Maybe there was just a bit of anxiety because his movement was maybe a touch excessive. Just that kind of nervous movement where you're maybe overdoing it a little bit. That being said, though, he did a good job of threatening Beterbiev, particularly with the lead left hand. And he was able to time Beterbiev coming in, because that's one thing, is you understand that Beterbiev is most likely going to try and get some forward momentum. So you can almost brace yourself to think, okay, as I go backwards, this guy's going to come forward and then I can potentially counter him. And Yarde did do that quite well on occasions, particularly with his almost trademark left hook. And despite Yarde being able to threaten Beterbiev fairly well, as I say, I feel like when I say threaten, especially with the lead hand, he was giving Beterbiev different looks in the sense where sometimes Yarde would extend his arm out like a jab and kind of establish himself over that space between them, or he'd use a bit of a sweeping left hook, not as a power shot, but just to see if he can manipulate the guard of Beterbiev, unsettle Beterbiev, so Beterbiev just can't advance forward like he'd want to, because Beterbiev's not really a fast guy, but he's someone who he's able to force himself forward, and if he lands, it's going to be a rough night for you. It's going to be a painful night. But we know Anthony Yarde has quite a decent active guard. The only thing is his head position, at least in this fight, it was working within a very narrow range. So you can see his hands are kind of changing quite nicely, giving Beterbiev those different looks. However, his head position isn't really deviating from one spot that much. And I feel like because that presents a relatively static target, Beterbiev was maybe interpreting it as, okay, as long as I can get past these threats of Yarde, my offense is going to line up pretty easily. And I feel like we did see that throughout the fight. But in some attempt to remedy that, Yarde began to incorporate a bit more head movement. And you could start to see his head movement was just, the range of it was increasing a bit more. And for the most part, I think he did that quite effectively. It was some good defensive responsibility from Anthony Yarde. Although there were moments where Artur Beterbiev was able to time it fairly well. I remember, I think it may have been in the second or third round, Yarde preempted an attack from Beterbiev, rolled to his right while stepping, because that's something he did quite well, is he would take an angle and get some distance as he rolled to the right half of his stance. But Beterbiev is kind of fighter where he understands that if a target is moving and it's difficult to hit, make it static. And he's no stranger to using physicality to make you stay still. And he did that, and he timed Yarde's roll, because as Yarde was about to come up, Beterbiev kind of used a bit of a throwaway left hook, held him in place, and then landed a right uppercut. And that was a bit more of the displaying some of the wrinkles that Beterbiev has to his game. And also, overall, I did feel like Yarde was just expending a bit more energy, or a fair amount more energy than Artur Beterbiev. Because Beterbiev, I don't want to say he's like a light heavyweight Golovkin. I do believe that someone like Golovkin does cut off the ring a bit better than Artur Beterbiev. However, Beterbiev is very economical with his movement. He doesn't waste a lot, and he's very well conditioned anyway. And so is Anthony Yarde for that matter. Both guys, I think, have proven themselves to have quite good engines. Some would say Anthony Yarde doesn't, but I think with Anthony Yarde, it's a pacing issue. Because if you have two guys who have good stamina, the guy who paces himself better is typically going to come out on top. Because even if you have good stamina, you can still waste it. And as I say, I think the nervous energy of Yarde starting, but also the pressure of Artur Beterbiev did get to Yarde. However, Yarde's, I don't remember looking at this fight and thinking that Yarde's gassed and like he's running out of energy. But it did seem like every time Beterbiev landed, it took something out of Yarde, even if it was just the jab, because we know that Artur Beterbiev really does have freakish power. And I think he doesn't really get a lot of credit for the accuracy of his shots, because a lot of the time when he's not landing with the fingers, he's not landing with the thumb, he's landing very properly, clean on the target. There were a lot of times where he was just able to disrupt Anthony Yarde's attacks, especially with the jab, and he didn't even need to get that much distance. So Artur Beterbiev is someone who has a good way of getting power in really short shots. And so even if they look like there's not that much space that they have to travel and pick up that velocity, he is able to really hit you with a damaging shot. And Yarde, even early on, I just felt like, you're starting to see the damage come up in his face. You're seeing these accurate shots from Beterbiev. And, Beterbiev's one of those guys where even if you're a puncher, he's just an enormous freakish power puncher, to the point where every time he lands, it takes something from you. It chips away at you quite a bit. And that being said, though, towards the end of the fight, 'cause as I say, it went 8 rounds. I feel like in the 5th, 6th, and the 7th, but definitely the 6th and the 7th, Yarde actually did a good job of really regrouping well, because I believe it was in the 4th where he was backed up to the ropes big time, and he was actually hurt quite clearly. And he was able to hurt Beterbiev with a long right hand. Beterbiev was able to see out the round and actually finish quite strong, even though you'd probably still give the round to Yarde. But Yarde, I felt he regrouped quite well. And as I say, Beterbiev throughout the fight was really doing a good job of disrupting Yarde's attacks before, during, and even after, just with that jab alone, which really shows the value of a really good, powerful jab. But it's also the application too. But Yarde also, I want to say, countered that in part by using ways of engaging Artur Beterbiev's high guard. There were a few occasions where Yarde would use a forearm. So he'd land some offense and he'd finish on a particular punch and then use the forearm of that same arm to physically block the hands of Artur Beterbiev's hands as he's in a high guard, and move off and leave the pocket. And that basically is just defensive responsibility, but it's a more physical defensive responsibility, because as we said earlier, even when Yarde was using that roll to the right hand or the right hand side, Artur Beterbiev would use his own physicality to get to Yarde. So Yarde kind of gave Beterbiev a taste of his own medicine, but just in a slightly different fashion. And I feel like that really showed how Yarde could win this fight, because Yarde had more than enough speed and power to hurt Beterbiev. That was evident. And I think most people understood that. But it's just going to be, how can Yarde minimize the damage he takes and maximize the damage he inflicts on Beterbiev? And that was one way I feel like, I don't want to say Yarde missed the trick, because of course it's easier said than done. But he showed he could do it in the fight, where he uses physicality against Beterbiev. Because Beterbiev, if you give him space, he does know how, he knows his way around the ring. I don't want to say he's the best technician, but he knows how to set up his punches, and he gets some very good movement in his punches. His movement quality is very good. You see that particularly with the right hand, which is something I highlighted in the pre-fight. Look at the right hand of Beterbiev. Look how well he comes off the center line and is just able to send that right hand just sailing over the lead shoulder of his opponent, crashing right into the head with crunching power. Beterbiev does that really well. The trajectory of his punches is just phenomenal. Very good movement quality, very high level technique, very very effective and efficient biomechanics of his punching. And that being said, though, you can get Beterbiev and lock him up a bit. You can do that with the kind of throwaway probing shots that Anthony Yarde used, because a lot of the time when Anthony Yarde just let those lighter shots flow, he was actually able to pin Beterbiev's gloves to his head, work some offense, and then use that physical forearm control on the high guard of Beterbiev and work out. But it just wasn't used consistently enough. And it's quite strange when you think about it, because Yarde has a very slick, quote unquote, I think that's how people would describe Anthony Yarde. His movements are very fluid, they're very slick. There's a smoothness to his technique. And typically fighters who have those characteristics, they tend to be quite good defensively. But with Anthony Yarde, there are some defensive holes there. So it really didn't surprise me that much when I started to see him getting tagged early on, because I do think the defensive responsibility of Yarde, it does cost him ultimately, and I'm sure that's something that he can work on. I think it's just maybe developing a bit more of that range of head movement, making it a bit more consistent, because we saw that Yarde could do it, but just making it more consistent. And also, I don't know, maybe just understanding or improving Yarde's understanding of what he's at risk of being hit by when he's in a particular position relative to his opponent. And now, obviously, these are all ideals, really, but, going off of what we saw in the fight, I think both guys will want to look to improve, because, let's be real, light heavyweight it's a bit of a shark tank, I think it's fair to say. So those are my impressions of the fight from a technical perspective. That being said, I feel like both men performed very well. Some of you maybe saw my community post. I feel like the champion Beterbiev showed a champion's resolve, where he's away from home in front of a crowd that is almost entirely in favour of Anthony Yarde, given that it's in London. But he's the champion with his 3 belts, and he's willing to go into the lion's den to defend his titles, and does so, weathers some rough moments against the guy who's very athletic, very dynamic, got plenty of firepower of his own. And Beterbiev came through that using his experience and displaying a lot of resolve, as I say. Anthony Yarde, even though he lost this fight, and ultimately it was his corner stopped the fight, which I don't have an issue with, because I think Yarde was going to be taken out sooner or later. Yarde showed immense amounts of bravery. I don't know if he showed technical improvements, but he was definitely sharper than what I've seen before. But I'm just not sure if I saw anything new from Yarde. Maybe I have to look a bit closer. But it seemed like the same Yarde, but he was just operating at higher gear. And of course, this time, he was in against, yes, a Russian champion, but Beterbiev, who's stylistically very different to someone like Kovalev. And that can obviously shape how a fight plays out, and ultimately how a fighter looks as well, because it's about how their strengths and weaknesses interact and gel with the strengths and weaknesses of their opponent. So I still think that Yarde has a very bright future, and I think even though he suffered a loss, he can really, puff his chest out, and he gave it his best go. But ultimately, he was just in with a very special fighter in Beterbiev, who, undisputed is still up for grabs. But Beterbiev versus Bivol, that's a toss-up. One day I may pick Beterbiev, one day I may pick Bivol. So Beterbiev could potentially go on to be a historically great light heavyweight. I'm a poet and I didn't know it. Obviously, time will tell regarding that, but I think he's certainly a historically great light heavyweight puncher. That is a fact for sure, 100%. But yeah, other things regarding the fight, the stoppage, I didn't have an issue with at all. I felt like, you have to factor in that Anthony Yarde was shipping quite a bit of punishment. And yeah, he had his own success, but he didn't have, at least from what I saw, he didn't have the same effect on Beterbiev with his punches as Beterbiev had on Yarde. Yarde was really starting to mark up, and yeah, was just shipping some heavy punishment. And ultimately, Tunde and Yarde have been in partnership for a long time, many years, and I'm sure they consider each other family. And there's only so much that Tunde's going to be able to stomach and see, because Yarde is someone who is essentially reared in a boxing sense. So I feel like it was the right call. And yeah, ultimately, Beterbiev won in the 8th round. I was a round off because I picked Beterbiev to win between 9 and 11. So I didn't place any bets though. But I do feel like the fight played out somewhat as I outlined in the pre-fight video. But nevertheless, those are my impressions on this fight. Maybe if anything else comes up, anything of note or significance, well, I'll do another video. But for now, those are my impressions of the fight. Massive respect and credit to both men, the champion and the challenger. This is what boxing is about. Laying it all on the line and going for it. Even if you're up against a monster like Beterbiev, I saw a quote from Anthony Yarde talking about, how the feeling of coming up short will never be as bad as the feeling of regret for not taking an attempt at something. I'm paraphrasing, but it was along those lines. And, I can really get behind that. So, you always get respect for going for it, win or lose, as long as you lay it all on the line, put your all into it. And I think that's what Anthony Yarde did. So credit to him. And of course, credit to the champion. Artur Beterbiev continues his knockout streak. Unbelievable. But yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comment sections below. What did you think of this fight? And what do you think of my technical review, if you want to call it that? But for now, thanks for listening, people, and I'll catch you on the next video.